I'm happy to introduce the next speaker, which is Gillian Kennedy. And she's a speech and language therapist in London at the University College. And she's also one of 2 NIDCAP trainers in the UK. Singa Warren, the other one?
She is.
Yeah, person we've also seen in these meetings several times. Yeah. And you're also a national advisor on speech and on these issues, or
I have been, yes, in the past, and I'm on NICE guidelines. Yeah.
And what was most remarkable in your CV here was that you were awarded an OBE, which stands for Officer of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire. Yeah. And you were not awarded by the Queen, but by Prince William.
By Prince William.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Well, thank you for that lovely introduction. That really just means that I got to buy a hat. So, but it was a very special occasion. And I'm very happy to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation.
Do you need the notes?
No. Yeah. That's great. This one, and then I have to use this, I think, for the video.
No, are there errors, or you use this?
I'll use this, but I use that to click the video. That's fine. Thank you. So I am following on from great speakers in the day, and mine might be a little bit more what happens on a day-to-day basis. So let me share with you, I have amended my title slightly to talk about the baby's emerging competencies for bottle feeding, because I think that in the past we have often worked and focused on bottle feeding right at the time that the baby starts to feed orally, and now, as with everything that we're learning about babies, they're supported if we begin to know them and support their emerging abilities much, much earlier on in their care. So, as Erin has said, there are sometimes very good reasons why, particularly perhaps in the United States and in Great Britain, where our breastfeeding rates are perhaps not as generous as in other countries, families, mothers in particular, may choose to bottle feed, but sometimes there is no choice. So it is not unusual on our unit for us to have mothers who are delivering in their 50s, in their mid-50s, having had assisted conception, and for them lactation is really a challenge, so they will go on to bottle feed. We have quite a population who, for cultural or religious reasons, may breastfeed or breast and bottle feed, but when the baby, even though they have wanted maybe to exclusively breastfeed, is ready and is very wakeful at feeds, the mother can't always be there. For example, with our Orthodox Jewish population, they can't be there on religious festivals like the Sabbath, because they may live far from the hospital and they can't use transport. So the baby, they know, is awake and wanting to feed, and they want the baby to have pleasure, and so bottles are introduced. And like with Erin, we also have a population where our mothers who are self-employed particularly go back to work very, very quickly and make the decision to give a bottle. Perhaps it's no surprise that, as with everyone else who has talked today, our population who perhaps go on to have bottles introduced more than any other are our extreme preterm infants, who will, of course, present with comorbidities. And Sophia, you were mentioning that your lovely daughter actually went home on oxygen and with a tube. So she still had challenges physiologically, and that has to be taken into consideration when we're asking something demanding of the baby, like going on to bottle feed, where it's not just fully under the baby's ability, but there is that potential for us as a feeder to override the baby's cues. So, of course, our previous traditional practice was that we thought early intervention equated to non-nutritive sucking opportunities. And we thought we were doing very well if we gave the baby a soother to suck, either when the baby was having a tube feed, or we thought the baby might just like it. We never thought that the baby's sucking response to that might be their self-regulatory endeavour, rather than showing signs of feeding readiness. And then we had the classic 3 T's. We determined that the baby was at a certain postmenstrual age, perhaps 36 weeks, and therefore they should be starting feeding, regardless of what the baby was demonstrating in the stability of their physiological system or their motor systems or their attention interaction systems and their state systems, for example. The other thing that we had up our sleeve were teats and, of course, a veritable smorgasbord of bottles. And they were the things with which we equipped ourselves, and then for good measure, we would put in specific techniques, like the classic occipital hold of the infant and using cheek and jaw support. And of course, our goals were met. The volume in the bottle would go down quite quickly, and we never took into consideration, or we didn't take it into consideration enough, that we were changing the intraoral pressure in the baby's mouth, and the baby was therefore having a far greater delivery of flow than perhaps physiologically and developmentally they were ready to cope with. And Kathy Shaker talks about this lovely skill that babies have of often loosening their seal around the teat to let out excess milk if they feel that too much is coming, for their ability to suck and swallow and coordinate breathing. And of course, unsurprisingly, historically, at the time that we were doing these things about 20 years ago, we were finding an increased risk of aversive feeding behaviours in follow-up. And we should marry that up with the fact that Sophia has said she had the best care that she possibly could, and yet her daughter then had feeding challenges. So there are going to be the occasions where we do everything right, and yet the baby will still go on and have feeding difficulties. So of course now our current practice is that we have very close collaboration between parents and staff. And this is largely built on Barry Brazelton's work and Heidelise Alce's work, looking at this individualization of family-centered care, where we are really learning to read the baby's cues of their thresholds for competence and where they start to unravel, and incorporating that into everything that we do with the baby. And I think that it's because we are doing this, helping parents to learn their baby's early language, that we are making much more progress in terms of progressing to bottle feeding. And at the end, I will show you a video of a baby's first feed, where The mother doesn't have to be told about pacing or where to put the bottle. She is so in tune, having worked with her baby and been supported by staff, not worked with her baby, but cared for her baby independently for so long, that she really knows what he needs at the point that he has that first challenging bottle. And of course, we try and redress the balance for babies of their previous negative oral experiences. These rigid endotracheal tubes, the constant suction. We shouldn't underestimate the effect that constantly having a regular delivery of moisture from your CPAP or your vapotherm into your nasopharynx and your oropharynx has on your ability then to view things pleasurably. So it's excellent now that we're starting to redress the balance by starting very early to use, as Anne was saying, mouth care with colostrum very early on, either in the syringe or as an opportunity for the baby to suck non-nutritively on the mother's finger. It's good to know that you are using maternal odour. We are very good at using it very early on, but actually we don't keep using it. And we know from Joy Brown's work, and which is building on Benoit Charles' work, and now Dorothy Vintner's just published work, that of course odour fosters early attachment. And we know that it ameliorates against physiological sequelae during painful procedures. But do we often think about odour helping the baby make the transition from tube to full oral feeds? So this is a study that I wasn't really familiar with, the Yildiz study, which is done with babies who are breastfed babies, where from the time they are 32 plus 6 weeks, the babies in the study group, as opposed to around 33 weeks, the controls, the babies had an impregnated pad of their mother's milk, 33 weeks being the time that the baby identifies their own mother's milk, and that was there for the 30 minutes in which they had their tube feed. And these babies went on to transition 3 days quicker to full oral feeding. And I feel that this is something that we should also be thinking about using with all our babies, regardless of the mode of feeding that they are going to go on orally. Or of course, studies have to be done, but it's something else that we could think of that's going to cause no harm in the meantime. And one of my passions is thinking about the influence of gut immaturity of feeding, something that we have heard a lot about today. We're very good at recognizing the cardiopulmonary immaturity, and that's possibly also because that's reflected in monitors. But the baby themselves are the only ones that can reflect the effect of the influence of the gut immaturity on their comfort. So this is not the forum today to discuss whether gastroesophageal reflux disease does or doesn't exist in preterm infants. But what we do know is that many of our preterm babies do exhibit digestive discomfort, and they are the babies who have poor weight gain or who have weight loss and who frequently have these dysaturation and bradycardic episodes. What I'd like to show you is a very short snippet of video, and it is a repetition 3 times. But what I'd like you to see is this is a little toot who has just drunk. This is during a video fluoroscopy. And what I want you to watch is the ease at which the milk comes right back up again. One cycle. Now, in this case, I can tell you clinically, having been there, the baby wasn't bothered at all. But you can see that's a lot of milk and coming up with great ease. However, when we translate this to what we see for babies when they're on the unit, when we can't have that internal view of them, we can see how much what's happening internally affects them, including things like in sleep. And then you see these very classic behaviors of the mouthing, the gagging. How she's lost her colour. And as she kind of gets over that bout and settles again, if you watch the spots on her baby grow, you'll see how her respiratory rate has increased. So when we think about feeding, we also have to consider the gut and its wider influence on the brain. So in terms of feeding, if this little bean is constantly challenged and working harder with her breathing and having all these movements on a repeated basis, it's really not surprising that her weight gain is going to be slower. And if she has milk coming up and it's uncomfortable, why should she associate her stomach being full with something necessarily pleasurable? But also, we are learning more and more and more about the influence of sleep on a grown-up brain. So, for example, the recent research that is showing that in adults who really have very poor sleep patterns, that they are much more likely to have a higher burst of release of amyloid proteins. Now, this is not my field, but that the waste disposal of this amyloid protein can't keep up with that. And that is what's leading to the changes in terms of healthy brains to perhaps leading to Alzheimer's. So if that's happening with healthy mature brains, then the onus is on us to really look at digestive comfort to protect the baby's sleep on these very immature brains that are constantly connecting. So, I'm going to skip over this and just quickly go into summarizing and saying that disrupting sleep and sleep cycles, which we've learnt from Niels today, are really only truly happening in kangaroo care, but profoundly affects the creation of permanent neural circuits, and therefore it's very much interfering with the baby's early sensory processing and brain development. And of course, that can lead to adverse neurodevelopmental outcomes later in life. So the next way that we endeavour to redress the balance is skin to skin, and all of us, Jill, are steering away from this, because why would you cover it when you have the gurus in the room? But I think we think about skin to skin and oxytocin release on relationships, and perhaps less think of it on the influence of the gut. But it improves gut motility, and also your oxytocin receptors in your gut are so important for the physiological regulation of gut function. So they reduce the stress on both the gut and ergo on the brain. So using kangaroo mother care for oxytocin to promote digestive comfort is also so important. Now, there are reviews about non-pharmacological management of digestive discomfort, and they include, of course, determining the frequency of feeds, and we have seen why we should aspire to doing very small feeds more frequently. But some of us work in areas where teams need to be convinced. And so I am going to go back armed with this. And, you know, we need this very strong evidence. And but it is not unusual in our units for babies to have 3-hourly feeds. We have made a stride forward in that we then seem to go on more from there to baby-led feeding, but actually it is not out of the ordinary for 4-hourly feeds to be put in there, which is just so not physiologically suitable. And of course, we know that non-nutritive sucking can be beneficial. It can help with the baby's weight gain and release of lipase from under the tongue for fat absorption. And we try to think about the ways in which we position the baby if the parents can't be there to do holding. So positioning the baby on the right side, which will... Okay, so do I get an extra 2 minutes to make up time? Okay, good. I'll talk quickly. But for those of us that are still doing gavage feeding, I think one of the things that we know, which has been demonstrated beautifully again by Jacerla, is the fact that the thing that makes a huge difference on reducing the number of significant events during the feeding cycle during a tube feed is the rate at which the milk is given. Now, if you have a nurse who's looking after 4 babies, then we talked about pragmatics versus what we aspire to. However, I would challenge us to perhaps think creatively. Ideally, we would have the family there. But if families, because of other children or distance, can't be there, then thinking what we could do in terms of volunteer cuddlers, if families were happy for that. We have a lot of midwifery students on our unit who could also be the ones that hold the baby and give the feed slowly, so that it takes the pressure off nursing staff and it gives the baby what the baby needs. Oh. I seem to be stuck in my slide advancement. Stina? It's stuck, not working. Oh, it's not on the computer. Oh. I'm so sorry. Okay, well, I'll look up here. It's fine. No worries. Honestly, it's good. Yeah. One of the things, Renee was asking me, well, what was in my wish list of things if I had my time again to look at. And one of the things that we do is we often elevate the cot a little bit, don't we? But we need to think carefully about the impact of the degree of our cot elevation on the baby. And so often on our units, I go in and the cot is so elevated that you see the baby lying in a very extended posture, working anti-gravity, which of course is contributing to this immature GI system of squeezing the transient lower esophageal sphincter, and then the baby can't hold that any longer, so travels to the bottom of the cot, scrunches up the stomach, and the sphincter goes woof, and up comes the milk again. So we need to think pragmatically about cot elevation and what is the right time. So where we can on our incubators, we mark with pen the tilt, and we put up these slides, this notice that won't be offensive to anybody, but just as a reminder, I'm not planning to ski, so just tilt me gradually so that I can digest comfortably. The benefits of side-lying I referred to earlier are because Zangers has shown that really gastric residuals are less, but the emptying is quicker if the baby lies, these preterm babies lie on their right side after feeding. This was a poster which I'm sure Niels will be particularly interested at Jen's, and I looked at it, but their recent work, again they used ultrasound, is proposing that actually one way to assist with gastric emptying is to increase the volume that the baby is given, which of course goes completely against what we were hearing this morning. And it would have to be said that for those of us clinically, that makes perfect sense as to why this would not be a good thing. We know that when we give the babies bigger volumes, and in old-fashioned units, I shouldn't say that like mine, we're a super unit, but I think sometimes we could change practice with regard to timings of feeds. And so when we have these extended intervals between feeds, we're giving these bigger volumes, we see that the babies aren't managing to digest comfortably. So we go back. Okay, so then the baby is showing us that they're ready to feed. And feeding for the first time has to be led by the baby, not our imposition of when we think is the right time for the baby to feed. So these are 3 snapshots of YouTube videos so they're out there for everybody to see, of babies' first feeds. And I think we don't need to see the videos to have a sense of, it might be our drive for the baby to have this first bottle feed, but actually maybe the babies are saying something else about the experience. And finally, what I want to talk about is thinking of the baby's emerging motor system, so that we know that term babies have this wonderful cutesy ability to sustain their muscle tone and their posture, but that preterm infants need quite a bit of facilitation in order to be in a good position for bottle feeding. And whilst we've recognised that, we've perhaps adopted some fairly unorthodox options for trying to support the baby. The occipital hold we mentioned earlier. This is another so-called supportive strategy, thinking if we swaddle the baby enough that the baby will be held in a good position. But actually we need to think what will support the baby motorically and physiologically. And one method that has been explored, but up until very recently, just in 2 very small studies, has been elevated side lying, which I'm sure that we weren't the only ones 25 years ago that were using it, but now a number of people have been trying it. It's basically a breastfeeding position rotated round 90 degrees, but the baby is supported in that they're not having to use energy holding themselves upright in the traditional semi-cradled position, and so they have better control over the flow of the milk. They can keep their energy, and also physiologically we wondered if the baby would be more stable. So in the initial 2 small studies where babies were used as their own controls in elevated side lying and elevated semi-upright, in the original study, which Liz Clark, my colleague, led on, we found that there was higher saturations in elevated side lying and a trend towards a less variation in the heart rate. And Ginny Park and Suzanne Thor's study, which had a smaller number of feeds in it, showed the opposite way round. And I'm delighted that someone has gone forward and done a randomized control trial. It's not huge. There were 80 babies in the study, and this is the latest study by Gergen, which has shown, in fact, both features reached significance, so that it seems that babies can be supported physiologically using this elevated side-lying position in order to support their efforts in bottle feeding. And one of the things, as Erin said, that we can do lots of working with us as staff to help us recognise the baby's cues and to know what strategies to implement. But the fact is that we bring our own life experience, and only one person can breastfeed the baby, but innumerable of us on a neonatal unit can bottle feed a baby. And we all may think that we've done the Sophie and we're doing it right, but we all may take a different take. So consistency of feeder is really important as far as possible. And so I'd like to suggest, as I come into land, that actually one of the things we really need to think about is clarity of methodology if we're doing research like this, because in all 3 different studies, different side-lying positions were used. These are not pictures from the studies, but people's interpretation of what elevated side-lying is very different. So you need not only to have descriptors, but you need good photographs. And I would argue that actually having the feet against the feeder's body is not where you want the baby. You want the baby to have a stable base and actually to be sitting against the feeder so that the head and the neck are in alignment for good airway protection and control. So from Daniel and me, thank you.